Okay, and we are live. And so, Jolene, go ahead.
Well, good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for attending our first of one of three nights. We want to thank everyone for taking the time as we explore tonight's topic, which is Alameda Police Department's policies and training. As I mentioned before, we are doing three of these nights. The next will be Thursday, November 11th, and that will be covering data and professional standards and procedures. And Sarah, remind me of the timing on that one.
The next one is at 6:30 p.m.
6:30. And then the third will be on Monday, November 16th, and that will be going over budgets and staffing. And I think the timing's the same, yes?
I think it's at 6. Just to be confusing, they're all at different times.
I wanted to just take a minute to sort of introduce sort of who I am. My name is Jolene Wright, along with my good comrades and friends and neighbors, Al Mance, Cheryl Taylor, and Christine Chilcott. We have been working alongside Eric as a steering committee to help sort of get a sense of where we're at. I think you can take a look on the city's website if you want to get a sense of updates for what the steering committee is working on, alongside our wonderful collection of Alameda residents who are working on our subcommittees, and I'll dig into that a little bit in a minute. Sarah, I have the link up for the Residents Policing Review and Racial Equity website. It would be great if we could get that in a chat or out there in the world.
Absolutely, I'll put it in the chat.
Cool, just so people have that. And as I've said, we've really been given a wonderful opportunity to work with, just some of the most amazingly dedicated folks that I've come across as we really look at our current city policies and look at ways to make recommendations to improve that, to really ensure that our values are reflected in the way that we police in 2020 and beyond. I do want to shout out to all 5 of the committees, and if you're unfamiliar with what they are, I'll just go through them. We have one committee who's looking at unbundling police services. We have a policies and practices subcommittee, a police accountability subcommittee, sort of looking at racism and anti-racism in Alameda, and a subcommittee looking at decriminalizing laws of survival. And I just have to shout out again to the incredible work that those committees have done over the past few months. I'm going to snap it out for everybody. Thank you. So we'll sort of take a beat and just go through kind of our core mission statement with the steering committee. And it's long, but I feel like it's important to read it out loud just for center. Engender an Alameda that is safe, welcoming, and supportive for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to live, work, play, and pray, and to be ever vigilant that we are practicing the principle of everyone belongs here. Most of our recommendations will be sort of made with an eye towards the protection of Black, Indigenous, people of color, because we are disproportionately penalized. But we are secure in the knowledge that all of the recommendations that we're making will just be, good for everyone, marginalized, underrepresented communities, as well as our neighbors who are used to a certain level of service. We're dedicated to that goal. And we, again, just want to ensure that everyone, our friends, our family, our residents, and even others visiting our communities are just experience that same level of service and professionalism. So we started central to this with an exploration and an in-depth look at community stories, at collecting data, as well as conversations with APD and city staff, hence this meeting. Simultaneously, we're taking a comparative look at best practices throughout the country so we can be fiscally responsible and not reinvent the wheel where it's not necessary. I'll take a minute to shout out to all of our partners in this endeavor. Eric, Jerry, City Council, Lisa Foster, Sarah Henry, the folks at the library who are helping with packets of information. We just want to say thank you for helping support this and putting this night together. We also want to take Interim Chief Randy Fenn, who joined us for a night. Randy, was it your second night? Your second day on the job? So we really appreciate that. And we want to thank Captain Emmett and Captain McMullen for joining us tonight as well. That's my intro spiel. I will walk a bit into the process of where we're at. You know, loosely, I think we're working in kind of the 5 Ds of strategic design, and I'm sure that's gobbledygook to most of us. You know, one of the first tenets of it is your discovery process, you know, sort of looking where you're at, level setting, hearing stories, figuring out the problem, and then sort of moving into a design phase. And I think that's really where we're at right now. Working towards our first goal of sending over some draft recommendations to Eric in the coming weeks. After you go through your design period, you'd also go into your develop period where you're really building and exploring and seeing what you can do. And then you move into your deploy phase, acknowledging that this, you know, might be a very long timeline, but that's sort of where we're at. And then after that, you'd move into your debrief, sort of to see what's working, what's not working, what needs to be adjusted. I had a really, really great diagram showing that, but didn't get it to Sarah to put it up. That's all I have. I'd love to take a minute for Christine and Al if there's anything that they want to add before we hand everything over to Sarah and Chief Fenn to kick us off for the night.
I would just like to say thank you for all of the work with the subcommittees. It's quite extensive. And thank you to everyone in the city who's been a very helpful partner in turning around a lot of information on short notice. And thank you to everyone in the police department that's joining us tonight so that we can learn a little bit more. So thank you all.
And I'd like to follow up with that by just welcoming members of the public who will be viewing on YouTube. This is the first conversation that we're having with the first informational session. It won't be the last. Hopefully it's the first of many. And we're hoping that in the future we can have increase the ability for the public to look at themselves, gain more knowledge about their practices. Change ideas.
Thanks, Al. Thanks, Christine. Sarah, Chief Fenn, it's all you.
Great. Thank you, Jolene. Thank you, steering committee and subcommittee members who are here with us on Zoom, and to the public who's watching us on YouTube. My name is Sarah Henry. I'm the city's public information officer, and I'm here tonight to just help the steering committee with the Zoom presentation about the Alameda Police Department policies and training. Joining us tonight from the Alameda Police Department are Interim Police Chief Randy Fenn, who, as many of you know, has only been here in Alameda for 6 weeks, but he has 30 years of service as a police officer and 4 years as a police chief. Police Captain Matt McMullen, who's worked for APD for 18 years and currently is the operations captain, which includes patrol and investigations. And Police Captain Jeff Emmett, who has been a police officer for 19 years and with APD for 21 years. And Jeff works opposite of Matt in the Services Bureau. So following the brief remarks from our police department, they're here along with our city attorney's office to answer as many of your questions as time allows. And I just want to note that all participants have been muted. So steering committee members and subcommittee members can submit questions at any time into the chat tool. And over the last few months, the police department, as Jolene had mentioned, have filled 43 information requests from the community-led subcommittees related to APD and 6 additional information requests from other departments. So if there are questions about the information that's been received in addition to the presentation tonight, we can try to answer those questions. And just a last note, I think you all know, but this meeting is being streamed live on YouTube and it's being recorded. And when it's done, we'll post it on the city's YouTube channel. So I'd now like to ask Police Chief Randy Fenn to kick things off for the police department, and you should be able to unmute.
Okay, am I good?
You're good.
All right, thank you, Sarah, Jolene, and others from the committee for hosting this evening and for the important work that you're doing on behalf of the Alameda community. Just a few brief remarks from me, kind of that 30,000 foot view, if you will, about the police department, kind of policing in general, and then the police department here in Alameda. And then I'm going to hand it off to my colleagues, Captain Emmett and Captain McMullen, to kind of bring it a little bit closer. I have probably about 10 years or so of experience, police experience on them, but they have about 20 years of Alameda police experience on me. So hopefully between the three of us, we can answer your questions and give you some good insight into police operations here in Alameda. And at the sake of sounding a little too basic, recognizing that we have the public, non-committee members that are watching as well, I just wanted to give a really quick overview of kind of how it works in California. You know, there's 58 counties, there's approximately 430 incorporated cities in California, and about 330 of them have police chiefs. The others, a lot of times they contract out their police services to their sheriff's department. So we are of course bound by California law. And then we have some oversight, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes about how there's training oversight through the California Post, which is the Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training. But first and foremost, we adhere to California law, all 330 of us police chiefs. We are appointed by city managers. They have the hiring and firing authority. We are not appointed by city councils in virtually all of the jurisdictions. And just so you know, there's only one police chief in California that is still elected at large. So the police chief in Santa Clara is like a sheriff. He or she has to run for election and re-election, but the rest of us are appointed by the city manager. The police chief sets policy and direction for their individual police department, again, within the framework of state and federal law, as well as the Commission on Peace Officers Standard and Training. And then there are general law cities and charter cities, and I won't get too deep into that, but Alameda being a charter city, we of course have we are governed by the Charter of Alameda and local ordinances as well. Policy, we're going to talk about policy, and policy is a big deal for very obvious reasons. We happen to use a service called Lexipol here in the city of Alameda, and that traditionally policies, although again are the responsibility of each individual police department. Going back to the beginning of my career, and certainly before I started, policies were kind of all over the place. While the vast majority of police departments and sheriff's departments certainly had them, it was rather loose in terms of what was required to be within a police department's or sheriff's department's policy manual. And over time, just like anything else, we have professionalized, and there are more laws governing now today. In fact, one has just passed in the last year where the legislature has stepped in and dictated a police department shall have a policy on, and we're going to get to that, for instance, use of force. So there are policies that are dictated by law, but by and large, policy is the responsibility first and foremost of the chief of police. And of course, the chief of police answers to the city manager, who answers to the city council. And so that's how policy is set. Now, why we use Lexipol? Lexipol is a private company formed primarily by former police officers who are attorneys, who became attorneys. Many of them left policing to pursue law careers. And basically what they have done is they have grown a company that takes attorneys and other staffers to continually call not only the legislatures and laws as they are enacted, but also almost more importantly, and before recently was the most important part, and that was case law. So decisions that were made at both the state and federal level, that case law becoming important to our policies to make sure that we did not run afoul of what the courts had decided whatever the case may be. A lot of times that had to do with police pursuits, use of force, and those things. Whereas the law, the written law, the legislature might have had a very generic definition or rule for certain behavior, and of course the courts over time interpret it. And I'm gonna stop there before I get too far out of my lane. I know there are attorneys on this phone call, and I don't want any of you starting to yell at your computer screen. But in essence, calling case decisions, court case decisions, is an important part of helping us develop policy. And so Lexipol does that. Now Lexipol has about 8,100 subscriber agencies in both police and fire throughout the country now. So they started in California. They are primarily a California company, but they have grown again to be much bigger than just within our state. And I think it's important to note that they are just a baseline. So when they present a policy, when we become subscribers electronically, I'm making a hand motion as if they hand it to us. They don't hand it to us anymore. It's electronic, but they hand us hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of policies that we then begin to look at and figure out what applies to the city of Alameda, because some of their base policy manuals just doesn't apply. Those are things that we don't physically have here, or physically issues here in Alameda. And then there are other things that absolutely, my last city that I was in, city of Fairfield, no Marine Patrol. We were also Lexipol subscribers. I didn't care about, you can get rid of everything about Marine Patrol. Well, obviously Marine Patrol is an issue here in Alameda, so we accept those policies, but then we take them and we personalize them. We keep the legal requirements, of course. We keep and that's the beauty of what Lexipol does, is they spell out for us what is California law, what is federal law, what's a California case decision, what's a federal case decision, and then what is considered best practices, because they have a number of experts in the field as part of their organization. And then we get to decide what we accept and don't accept, or how we personalize it, because we can take their base policy and we can make it more restrictive. So that's kind of I want to give you that so that you know going forward as we have this discussion about policy, that's what it means when we talk about policy within the context of the police department. Excuse me, within the context of the police department. Officers and the captains here will give you some more specifics, but we hire people, we train them. There are about 31 police academies in the state of California. The majority are they're all governed by California Post. And they have to adhere to California Post standards. And most of them are run in conjunction with a community college. Some, however, are run by very large police agencies, so they are standalone through that individual police agency. I believe Oakland still has their own, and of course, Alameda County Sheriff has their own. And so we use Alameda County Sheriff, we use Contra Costa County Sheriff. We will pay them to allow us to send a recruit to their academy, and that's how they get their basic training. And the basic training is about 6 months of full-time instruction, covering the gamut of things from learning to shoot to policy, procedure, first aid, and now it includes conflict resolution, classes on implicit bias. And so as society evolves, as the expectation on police evolves, so does the training and the topics that they cover in the police academy. After a recruit graduates and they become a police officer, we send them through a field training program, and I'm sure there'll be some questions about that. I believe that runs roughly 15 to 19 weeks. And we do that, we put them with senior officers who are specially trained to be field training officers. And then ongoing, the state of California requires a minimum of 24 hours of ongoing professional training every 2 years for every peace officer in the state. We handle that through a variety of ways, both in-house and by sending people to training. There's what's called PSP training, which is perishable skills, like driving, shooting, using the various tools we have. Those are considered perishable skills, because if you don't keep the muscle memory going, you lose the ability to do those things under stress. So we have to do some of that training as well on an ongoing basis. And then, of course, we're always looking for additional training and additional educational opportunities, again, as society evolves, as the demands of the Alameda Police Department evolve, and what's particular to the Alameda community, we're looking for those opportunities to train and to grow. And I guess with that, I will end by saying, and we are open to change and to growth and to development. I'm sorry the profession has gotten to this point. I'm sorry that that we see this national narrative, that it's gotten to this point where there's unrest in our streets. And I am hopeful. I believe it was Al asked a good question after I did introduce myself on my second night. You had an opportunity to send some questions, and he asked a good question about, of the criticisms, what criticisms do you agree with? And that's a big question, and there's certainly things that I wouldn't agree with that I think are unfair criticisms. But one absolutely that immediately popped to mind with Al's question was, we are not good listeners. We have traditionally not been good listeners. We have been, although we tout working with the community, and some police departments do a much better job than others. I think this is one that does a good job from what I can see. We have done it oftentimes with we'll tell you what you need in public safety, as opposed to, here's what we see in public safety. Community, tell us what you think you need in terms of your public safety, and doing a better job of working together. And I speak very broadly when I say that, and again, just 30 years of experience in a couple of police departments in a number of cities, that's been my observation. And my hope is that with all the unrest and all what we've seen these last months, that at the very least, that as we are on the precipice of real change in society and policing and all of that, that we do a good job of listening, that the dialogue is open, that it's honest and respectful, and with the absolute overarching goal of good public safety, good policing for everybody, that is absolutely equitable and is for everybody. So thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Captain McMullen or Captain Emmett, I'm not sure which one of you is going to go next.
I'm happy to jump in and give just a brief overview of what I do as captain of operations with the Alameda Police Department. I oversee what I would consider many to believe traditional police services: the traffic section, the parking section, the K-9 unit, as Chief Fenn appropriately pointed out, specific to Alameda, our Marine Patrol unit. And those are some of my primary responsibilities, coupled with in the realms of training. I oversee our field training program, which is, as Chief Fenn said, 19 weeks. We currently have 12 trainers who train new police officers, whether it be they come straight from a police academy, meaning they don't have any police experience prior to coming to Alameda, or if they're what we consider a lateral police officer who has been a police officer at a different jurisdiction and is coming to the Alameda Police Department, they still are required to participate in our field training program. In that program, there are 3 weeks of what we call in-house or off-street training, and the rest is with 3 trainers who have them for 4 weeks at a time and provide the Alameda specific way of doing policing. And in essence, that is what I oversee, amongst other things within the police department that I will talk further on, I'm sure, during this meeting. So thank you.
My turn?
Yes, please. Thank you. Sorry, I was muted.
All right. No, that's okay. And everybody can hear me okay? I'm trying
Yes.
some new headphones here.
They sound great.
Probably the wrong day to try a new piece of equipment, but first of all, I want to say thanks for having us. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and speak to everybody tonight. So as it was mentioned earlier, I am the opposite side of the house that Captain McMullen is on, and I oversee our Services Bureau, which incorporates our basically anything that you can think of that is not the typical police stuff. So it's, you know, typically when you think of policing, you think of patrol officers, investigations. I do everything on the other side. So our records unit, our dispatch center, most of our non-sworn employees, our professional staff fall under our services bureau. Our property and evidence, vehicle maintenance, building maintenance, all the non-police stuff. So part of the services bureau encompasses our personnel and training unit, which covers off on what Chief Fenn had talked about earlier, which is the continuous training that every sworn police officer has to receive every 24 months. And it comes out to about 24 hours of training every 2 years and there's 4 areas that are considered perishable skills. One of those is communication. The other ones is firearms proficiency. The third one is driving proficiency. And then the fourth one is defensive tactics. So those 4 areas have to be covered every 24 months. And then on top of that, we also will do what we call an advanced officers course. That also will incorporate those areas, but here are some other ones that it'll also encompass. And we actually just finished this advanced officers training at this month of October. And some of those topics that were covered during the training cycle were domestic violence, victim assistance, crisis intervention, use of force and de-escalation, crisis communication, and then the post-legislative requirements and legislative mandates. So the training is ongoing. Even though I've been a police officer for almost 20 years, I still have training requirements that I have to go through. And just to kind of see where, to give you kind of an idea of somebody with my tenure, the amount of training that you could potentially receive. I have about 2,719 hours of training over 19 years. And that comes out to about 143 hours a year of training. Just maybe as something you can use to kind of balance to see what a police officer will go through for a period of over your career. And then the other part of personnel and training is the hiring process. So the city human resources department is responsible for the hiring of all employees for the city, but we're a little different where, say, compared to like public works or the library, where we have other requirements that are set through post, the police officer standards and training, that we have certain requirements that all of our employees must meet before they are eligible for being hired. So the big part of that is the background investigation process that can take anywhere from a month to 3 months to complete, along with some other testing processes that they have to go through that maybe some other city employees wouldn't have to go through. But ultimately, the hiring is done through the human resources department. I'm sure that there are some other things that we'll get to through questions, but I don't want to take up too much time and leave as much time for all of you guys to ask questions. So thanks again for having us here. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Captain Emmett. So I have received a bunch of questions that Jolene shared from the subcommittees. And so Jolene, if it's okay, I can launch right into those questions with our speakers. Great. I see a thumbs up. Wonderful. So the first question for the captains, what are the qualifications for field training officers? How are they selected? And does a trainee officer have one FTO or many?
So I'll take that as it falls under my Bureau of Operations. So our field trainers, to say we are selective, I would say is an understatement. They go through a competitive process to become a field training officer before we even send them to school. And that is through performance evaluations, through years of dedicated service where they have shown exemplary investigative prowess, where they have shown initiative and aptitude to train. And we ask them to submit a memorandum of interest after they have completed their probationary period, after we have been able to witness how they perform in the field and evaluate their performance evaluations. After they submit a memorandum of interest, we then conduct a competitive interview process where there's a panel, typically comprised of at least one captain, a lieutenant, and the sergeant in charge of the field training program, which is overseen by that lieutenant and then supervised by a sergeant. After they're done with all of that, they typically get ranked, and then they are required to go to a post-certified school, which is not done here, but in the city of Alameda, but is through the police officer standards and training. They will go to a 2-week school where they are learned, where they learn about adult learning strategies, laws, and other things to help facilitate their growth in teaching and training. Once they then are trainers, we rotate typically, and every situation and every officer requires tailor-made training. But typically how it works is when they arrive here, we send them through a 2-week in-house where we kind of understand or get a better sense of their strengths and weaknesses as recruits. We teach them a little bit about our city structure. They get familiarized with the police department building, those that work in it, and our workflow. And they're introduced to their trainers. They also go through a little defensive tactics, a little shooting, and some other, I don't want to say refreshers, but familiarization with the city. They're introduced to a variety of people throughout the building, and then they start their first phase of field training, which typically lasts 4 weeks. After that, then they go to a second trainer who has, every trainer has their own strengths and their weaknesses and their own style of doing it. And then after that, they go to another, I call it a brief intermission, where they get to come back and do in-house training again, where we drill down to the finer details of tactics, communication, and some other skills that we have been able to witness and evaluate them performing in the field, and tailor make that for the second in-house. Then they typically go to a third trainer, someone different, where they get, again, exposed to somebody else, a different style, things that work for them. With one trainer might not be so natural for the trainee with another trainer. And it's highly beneficial to see how different police officers with tenure and experience can do the job and get the results that we are after in our policing strategies. And then they go back to their original trainer, where for the first 2 weeks, it looks like a 2-person unit. And then the last 2 weeks, we call it a shadow phase, where the field trainer will be dressed in plain clothes, but still have their tools to assist, but is literally just observing the trainee. And after they've gone through all of that, if they are proficient, then the sergeant in charge of the program will ride with them to further evaluate, to ensure that the trainee is up to speed on laws of arrest, detentions, that they're fluid, that they understand geography of the city, and that they can operate as a solo patrol officer. And then they give their recommendation to the lieutenant, who then ultimately signs them off, and then they are on the street by themselves. Now, without belaboring my response, sometimes folks have different bell curves in which they learn and speed in which they learn. Sometimes we extend it in certain situations with laterals. Sometimes we're able to shorten that, but typically the program is set for 19 weeks. So I hope I answered the question in that response.
That's great. Thank you. The next question also for the captains is, will the crisis intervention training that the officers are currently undergoing, will that be repeated, or is it a one-time thing?
I can take that question. So the idea back in 2017, when we first started going through the crisis intervention training, was that it would be an ongoing, continuous type training. So currently, what we have been doing is, as from 2017, it was March of 2017 when we started. All current employees at that time started going through the week-long course that's presented over at the Oakland Police Department. As we were cycling through, and it does take some time because those spots are limited. They offer that class to all county, and I'm sure even probably statewide law enforcement agencies. So we were cycling people through. And as we were doing that, we also brought in an outside trainer to the department for a week. And it was another 8-hour course that all of our employees went through. It encompassed crisis intervention training, but it also encompassed implicit bias training. So the idea was to keep that going. As we bring in new employees to the department, that is one of the courses that they are assigned to take at some point as those classes become available, as those new employees complete their field training program, like Captain McMullen had talked about. So yes, the idea is for it to be continuous training. What that scale will look like, I don't know if it's going to ultimately end up being a post recommended or a post guided refresher course. But when I was looking back through my training, even going back to 2002, we have had, it's been called different things throughout the years, but we've had crisis intervention training even when I was a new employee, going back to 2001 here at APD. So yes, short answer is it'll be continuous.
Great, thanks. We have a bunch of questions, so I'm just going to keep going. Another one for the captains. In the Molly Watkins incident, the neighbors tried to tell multiple officers that Mr. Watkins was just exercising. The officers responded by telling the neighbors that they were responding to a call and disregarding the information the neighbors were providing. Was the failure to listen to the neighbors the result of APD policies or procedures?
You want? I can start.
That's great.
If that's okay, and then Captain McMullen can jump in. So this is difficult. So as police officers, you always are trying to get as much information as you possibly can about the incidents that are occurring. But there's a time and a place for you to seek that outside information. One of the things that is driven into all police officers from the day that you go to the academy is that you have to control the scene. Once you can control the scene, you can then start looking for additional resources, additional information to help you make the best decision possible as you start to investigate and progress through the call that you're handling. I wasn't at that call. I don't want to speak to the information that was coming in when it was coming in, because it could change how you would view the call. It could change when the information was coming in versus at what point in the decision-making process you were ready to receive that information because it was safe for everybody to do so. Was it because of our policies and procedures that we didn't take that information, or if we didn't take that information? I would say no. None of our policies or procedures would prevent any of our officers from not receiving information from the public in making the best decision possible at the time.
Captain McMullen, should I go to the next question? Or did you want to add, or Chief Fenn? Sorry.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself there. We obviously need to be careful talking about that case because, you know, there's pending litigation against the city and all that. So we need to be careful. But let me speak to the broader issue, I think, and that is we have been trained. We were trained in as just police officers, not just APD, but we were trained as police officers in general. I think this is what Captain Emmett was also talking about, is that we take information and we go. We get what dispatch tells us and we go. And I got to be honest with you, with rare exception, we didn't expect calls coming into the dispatch center to be calls that maybe didn't have the best of intention. Or again, now we're starting to understand bias in a much broader context, societal context. So I think what you're going to see going forward for policing in general is our training changing, our ability to ask, and our need to ask better questions, not just the police officer handling the call, but the dispatcher taking the call, the supervisor listening to the call. This is some of those things as we're starting to see these cases now happening throughout the country. It's part of the cultural shift of policing in general. So we will always have to balance that. Look, the last thing we want to do is not go when people call. That is our job. It is a service business. But I think as incidents, again, we see these incidents throughout the country. This is going to be places where we try to improve service delivery and improve the way we do business. And that is and in these types of cases, maybe learn to ask better questions.
And somebody that I didn't introduce earlier is Alan Cohen from our city attorney's office. So Alan, did you want to talk about this as well?
Yes, I just wanted to point out that the city's really precluded from commenting too specifically on the aspects of the Watkins case. We have a pending claim, and these are sort of internal personnel matters, which we're barred by state law from getting into too much of a discussion about regarding, you know, what occurred during the incident, other than what's already out there, and what the departmental's investigation could or might say. So I just wanted to point that out and remind everybody to be careful about talking about cases in which we have an active proceeding.
Thanks, Alan. Chief, the next question is for you. When you were talking, this question came in and somebody wrote, of the 300 and more cities with police chiefs in the state of California, which have the power to hire and fire police chiefs? Uh-oh. You can unmute yourself now.
Okay, thank you. You have ultimate Zoom control. So the city manager in virtually all of those cities has the authority, except there are cities with a strong mayor form of government, and then the mayor would have the ability to hire and fire the police chief. But in virtually all those cities, it's the city manager who hires all department heads, not just the police chief, but the fire chief, the public works director, etc. So most cities, the city council hires and fires the city manager and the city attorney, and then the city manager hires all the department heads.
Great. The next question for Captain Emmett, this came up when you were talking. What does communication cover in perishable skills?
So again, that topic or that name has changed, over the years. But basically, it's crisis communication. So it's de-escalation is kind of the at its bones what it's talking about. How to get through to people who may be experiencing a mental health crisis. How to de-escalate a family disturbance. How can you effectively communicate with people that you come in contact out on the street? How can you improve your active listening skills? How can you better get your message across to the folks that you encounter on a day-to-day basis? So all of the things that you would think about in what it means to communicate, because that is 99% of our job is to communicate with people, whether it's not so much face to face anymore, but through Zoom or on the telephone, or if you do happen to have face to face with somebody on the street. But it's basically that de-escalation umbrella of communication, which again has changed names throughout the years: tactical communication, verbal, judo, all, it's kind of run the gamut. So, and hopefully that answers the question.
That's great. And I think the city manager, Eric Levitt, did you want to add to that?
No, I was actually going to add to the previous question.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead.
Answering on the hiring and firing of police chiefs. And that is, there are a few cities in addition, what he was referring to is substantially most cities in the state of California. There are a few cities that have recommending bodies such as oversight committees that will sometimes recommend. Usually it's in a strong mayor form of government, but not always. But the two I know of, for example, is in Oakland, where the oversight committee can, which is a board of citizens on police, they recommend to the mayor for candidates, and then the mayor has 3 or 4 candidates, and then the mayor has to appoint from within those candidates recommended. And I think Los Angeles doesn't have that, but they do have recommendations to the mayor on police issues and police personnel issues to a certain extent, but I do believe the mayor still has appointing authority of the police chief in that case.
The next, a comment came in. So Heather Reed, she's the chair of the Systemic and Community Racism Subcommittee, and she wanted to comment that the chief said in his remarks that he's sad that the policing has gotten to this point. However, she'd argue that we've always been at this point, and that and that's an important conversation to have, what we're doing right now. She said that many of our neighbors who've been saying this forever feel unseen and unheard, and they say that the violence isn't new, it's the cameras that are new. The next question is that it seems that many of the excessive force incidents that we hear about are done by young officers. Do you try to pair young officers with older officers?
So I'll try to jump in here the best I can. I haven't read any particular studies on this. However, I will take the comment that sometimes it's younger officers. I think that sometimes with maturity and with age that we gain some knowledge. Not only that, but physically we change a little bit as well, and we try to handle disputes a little bit different, whether that's by what Captain Emmett was talking about, by our words more than our actions. But I think as people grow in the profession, they learn tools and techniques and communication styles that seem to de-escalate more than a less tenured officer. I don't believe that it's intentional, but I have seen that some of our older officers have a little more finesse when trying to gain the cooperation or compliance at chaotic scenes. They just learn the tools and techniques that seem to work better than others. And so that would be my comment to that. As far as pairing officers, most of our field trainers have some experience. Some are more tenured than others, but in the city of Alameda, because of our staffing model and our limited employee resources, we typically have solo patrol officers, meaning they're patrolling in a car by themselves. Sometimes when staffing permits, we'll double them up. But typically, unless they're in field training, they're riding by themselves.
Actually, in follow-up to that, somebody asked what the average age is of Alameda police officer. I don't know if you know that. You could find that
Not
out.
off the top of my, not off the top of my head,
No.
I'm sorry.
No,
Okay.
yeah, I don't have that either. But that's something that I can get the answer on, and I can get it to the subcommittees if they would like.
Great, that's perfect. And then another follow-up, is there more training for young officers, or does it increase as you stay with the department? And if it's the latter, perhaps increased training should be considered for the newer officers.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that one more time for me?
Yeah, absolutely. The question was, is there more training for young officers, or does it increase as you stay with the department? And if that's the case, perhaps they should switch it and increase the training for newer officers.
So I would say initially the newer officers get more training. As Chief Fenn had mentioned earlier, the basic police academy is 6.5 months long. It's 1,048 hours in total for a police recruit to graduate the police academy. So that is where a bulk of their training is coming from. And then the training hours can vary throughout your career depending on what other responsibilities that you have. Our field training officers are going to get more training than the patrol officers who are not a part of that unit. Every 3 years, you have to go through a refresher course for the field training program. So every 3 years, you're going to get an additional, I believe it's 24 hours of training on top of your 24 hours of training that everybody has to receive. If you're a detective, you're going to receive more training based on the investigative assignment that you have. If you're a part of our Marine Patrol, you're going to receive extra training for that. So it just kind of depends on the course that the officers take throughout their career, what ancillary duties they decide to get involved in. But again, on average, every single police officer will have a minimum of 24 hours of training every 24 months.
Got it. The next question is asking, does APD have a SWAT team? And if so, why? And then just similar question, does APD have armored vehicles and why? This person stated that they understand the importance of renewing perishable skills, but they need to be the skills, but they tend to be the skills that are rarely, if ever, used.
So the short answer to those questions is yes, we do have a SWAT team, and yes, we do have an armored vehicle. I'll do my best to answer the question, and hopefully I'll articulate it in a clear manner that makes some sense. And if there's follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer those as well. The tactical arena in trying to resolve particular incidents requires copious amounts of training. And there are some situations that are just by their very nature very difficult to resolve peacefully. And that is the mission of our SWAT team, is to resolve conflict through hostage negotiation or crisis intervention for a peaceful resolve. Enveloped in that is an armored vehicle, but more importantly, I think it's an emergency response vehicle. We want to keep our police officers safe. We want to keep the community safe. We want to keep those tasked with handling these very difficult situations prepared for the worst and hoping for the best. I can assure you, as being a member of our tactical team for a few years, that the training I received made me a better patrol officer because they teach you tools and techniques to de-escalate, to provide safety for myself and those around me, both as officers and the public. And we want to be prepared to be able to respond to any incident in which we are called upon. Unfortunately, there are some incidents and some crimes that are just, they're just violent. And it's sad that we live in a society that happens sometimes, but if we are not prepared, we will it would put us in a situation that we couldn't respond appropriately with the proper personnel trained to resolve those critical issues and have the tools and the training to do so.
And then if I could just add, Sarah,
Yeah.
Alameda did not have a SWAT team until 1983, actually after 1983. It was March 3rd, 1983, to be exact. And that was the date that Alameda PD had an officer killed in the line of duty. It was a detective who was assisting the investigations division, was serving a high-risk search and arrest warrant for an individual who was known to be in possession of illegal firearms and narcotics. And during that search warrant, the suspect shot and killed Officer Rob Davies with an assault weapon. And it was after that date that the department decided to establish a team that could respond to those types of critical incidents that, to Captain McMullen's point, could offer another level of peaceful resolution, so that not only are we safe, but so the members of the community are safe, to include the suspects that we're trying to take into custody.
Got it. And then just two follow-up questions about the SWAT and the armored vehicle. First, the armored vehicle, somebody was asking about, the council had voted to sell that and they wanted to know what the status of that was.
I think I should defer to the city manager, but perhaps I don't want to overstep with that.
Okay, let's see. Sorry, Eric, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, so there's been a staff report put together, and that's going to be going back to council for consideration on that, just so that when a determination to sell it is, that they understand the upsides and downsides of that. So that's going back to on a future council agenda.
Okay. And then a follow-up about SWAT, is APD's SWAT team completely voluntary, meaning that being on the SWAT team doesn't take away from the other training or duties?
So I'll tackle that as well, as it falls under my purview. It is. We have lots of ancillary duties in the Alameda Police Department, whether it's helping out with major accident investigations where there's copious amounts of training involving calculations and skids and whatnot. But our SWAT team is an ancillary duty. There's a selection process. There's mandated training by policy that the officers have to go and do. And there's also continual training. Our SWAT team trains 160 hours in a year. And there's two components to our critical incident response team that I think it is worth mentioning here as well, that it's not, a SWAT team isn't what it's always portrayed as it is on TV. We have a large contingent of our critical incident response team that is trained excessively or extensively, not excessively, is trained extensively in those de-escalation tactics. They in turn can be trainers to other members of the department on the patrol teams to learn the best tools and tactics to deal with people in crisis. So they're behind the scenes, but they're incredible assets to the organization and to the community in teaching our officers what they learn in their continual training. And they also train quite regularly with the SWAT component.
All right, one more SWAT question. How often is the team deployed?
So we have records going back, but I won't say that it's not often, but it is, we don't haphazardly deploy our SWAT team. There's certain criteria. It is evaluated up the chain of command by sergeants and lieutenants and myself, including the chief. We don't take using that level of response lightly. But again, going back to Captain Emmett's comments that we want to do everything we can to keep the community safe as well as our officers. And so Captain Emmett actually led the team for quite a bit, so he might have some of those numbers off the top of his head that I don't have, but it's not an everyday occurrence.
So I don't have the hard numbers, but I was a part of that team in one shape or form or another for 17 years. The last going back to just over a year ago, my last assignment was as the commander who was in charge of the critical incident response team, which encompasses the SWAT team, the crisis negotiations team, our tactical dispatch team, and our tactical medics. And the number of deployments has ranged anywhere from 0 in a year to most of 4 in a year. And I would say average over the 17 years that I spent on that team, it was probably twice a year that we would be deployed for operations that would come up. And most of those are what we would consider high-risk search warrants. Or I'm sorry, high-risk arrest warrants.
Chief N, did you want to make a remark there, or I'll just go on to the next question?
You can go on to the next question, Sarah. Thank
Okay.
you.
No problem. Here's another question related. Do you purchase military equipment via the federal 1033 program?
No.
Okay, great. Another question that came in and during your initial remarks, how much of the training involves respectful communication as opposed to controlling this situation?
I'm sorry, Sarah, what was that?
The question was, how much of the training that is received involves respectful communication as opposed to controlling the situation?
I would say all of the training that we receive and that we put our employees through is always based in respectfulness, to include communication.
So I was just gonna say you have to understand that we're trained to control situations. That's why oftentimes the police have been called. That's why we've ended up in the place we've ended up. And so trying to ensure that we hire employees that are respectful to begin with, that have high emotional intelligence and understand how to talk to people in crisis, how to talk to people who are having a horrible day, and people that won't listen. Those are the skills that we're constantly trying to impart. I mean, the problem is, are we always great at it? No, of course not. We're human beings dealing with other human beings, but the basis of the communication, the quote unquote tactical communication, means we're trying to teach officers to control a situation, a domestic dispute, a fight, a neighbor dispute, you name it, to take control, but to do so in a manner that is least intrusive as possible. And that really should be the mark of policing in a free society. And I get we can see incident after incident on the internet and on the news where that did not happen, that did not go well. Sometimes it's the fault of the person in the public. Unfortunately, oftentimes it is the fault of the police officer or officers who responded. But I think in general, our goal is to handle incidents, to take control, because that's, again, why the police are there. A situation is out of control. Oftentimes that's why we're there, but to do it in as least intrusive a manner as possible. And so as we go to these training classes and we develop, and not every class or not every technique works, just like not every parenting techniques for those of us who are parents. I can't talk to my son the same way I talk to my daughter, and they expect my wife to talk to him differently than I do. And I don't always do it well, and neither does she. And that's what we all try to learn. Those are some basic human interaction skills. And I would say we have evolved as a profession, recognizing that is as important. Someone had asked the question before, it seems like we do these things that aren't used very much. Well, that's what makes them perishable skills, because thankfully we don't use our firearms very often. but when we do, we better be really good at what we're doing so that we don't hurt or kill somebody. An innocent person, what have you, that we use it appropriately, we use it right. And that's the same with our communication skills, our driving and all that. We don't often drive at high speeds, but when we do, we better do it properly. So all of that training is in evolving and learning as society. Again, I keep talking about society evolving and developing because that is a key to law enforcement developing and evolving as well, is that we do it alongside society and learn as society learns as well.
Great. And then City Manager Levitt, did you want to follow up with that?
Yeah, not on this question, but on the prior question.
Previous.
On the prior question again, the question about receiving equipment or purchasing equipment through military surplus type of equipment. And I just wanted to go a little further into it because it was a straightforward answer, which Captain already answered. But there may be people on this call or watching on YouTube who don't understand these programs. There's a couple major programs in the nation that have been out there. One is getting equipment through the military, which has had controversy with police departments and been part of the militarization of police departments, or at least that's the perspective. And then the second is with narcotics and using funds and equipment that have been captured through illegal narcotic transactions that police departments have been involved in regional task force. We haven't had involvement in those types of programs, partially because the values of the community are not supportive of that. So those are types of programs you've heard nationally that Alameda is not a part of those types of programs, or has not been recently a part of those programs. I don't think historically it has. I know recently it has not.
Great. A couple of follow-up questions on Chief, what you had just talked about and the comments before that. Can you explain the importance of controlling the situation? And this person is hoping that you'll be able to discuss this by referencing your personal experience.
Well, again, we frequently enter into, and as I seem to have a cat here that wants to be a part of the discussion as well. Sorry about that. From a medical emergency to a car accident to, again, a domestic dispute, these are the incidents that police officers handle thousands and thousands of times throughout their career and are happening every day, not just across Alameda, but across the country. And you enter into chaos. I can't tell you how many times over the years I've shown up and there's the glass is not completely settled in the intersection yet, and people are screaming because someone's been hit by a car, someone is trapped, a home is on fire. I mean, all of those things are chaotic. I've shown up and there's gunfire still happening. Those are chaotic situations. So people turn and look to the person in uniform to bring some sort of calm from the chaos and to try to again, protect people and do all those things that we see on TV in some respects, but in real life, it's exceptionally difficult. People under stress who normally would listen or would react a certain way. We can all think about it in our personal lives. We've almost been in an accident. We slammed on the brakes and our resting heart rate goes from about 65, 70 beats per minute to well in over 100. Well, we know that there are physiological responses that happen. We lose fine motor skills. We have tunnel vision. We have auditory exclusion, meaning we don't hear everything that happens. Well, those are stressful situations, and police officers are just as susceptible to those as anybody else, as any other human being would be. So it's really important that we train police officers, especially, and other first responders to respond under that kind of stress and chaos, to be able to control the physiological responses to stress. And so a lot of times when I see, as a professional, as someone who's been doing this as long as I have, when I see some of these things happen on TV, some of these awful incidents that we watch, I get the community's outrage. I absolutely understand that. You have to understand that there's outrage from me as well as a professional, because oftentimes I see a poorly trained police officer or poorly prepared police officer who is unable to control the emotion, who is unable to control the physiological response to stress, and they are overreacting, and they are creating a bigger problem because they are unable to control themselves, which makes them unable to control the situation. So hopefully that kind of answers the question. And so that's why we give so much training on the front end of a police officer's career, because so many people, of course, unless maybe they have some military training or something else, they're coming from all different walks of life, and they've never had people look to them during chaos or emergency and say, please help us. That person over there is armed, or that person over there is going to die if you don't intervene. Can you do something? When that happens to you the first time, a lot of people, they go catatonic. They can't respond. And we certainly can't have police officers or firefighters or paramedics who respond in a similar fashion. We have to train through it. We give them all that training on the front end, and then we keep training them throughout their career, because again, I've heard it said things like, police work is about 90 to 95%. It's boring. We're just kind of go call to call to call. We write reports. Most of the interaction we have with people, even when it's a crime, people cooperate. It can be kind of boring, but that 5 to 10% that isn't, it can be extraordinary. It can absolutely be life-threatening. It can certainly be the most challenging things you've ever done in your life. And so just like a doctor, pick the profession, they've got to be trained. They may not see your average emergency room doctor or surgeon may not see a gunshot wound victim for years and years and years. But God forbid you come in that night into the ER and you have one of those. You hope and pray that their training will kick in and that they will be able to rise to that occasion. So hopefully, Sarah, that answered the question.
That's great, Chief. Thank you. And a couple of other questions that I feel like kind of follow that up well. This person writes that it seems to be a tough balance. Community safety is clearly the number one responsibility, but crisis intervention, dispute resolution is a far more common task. How do you balance the two, and how do you think they should be balanced?
Well, I think that's a very important question. So I think as we're moving forward in this current environment, and it's been happening, as overdose has continued to be a problem, substance abuse, mental health, where our facilities to be able to handle mental health patients and those with mental illness, as the homelessness problem has exploded, especially in the West Coast, more and more onus has become on the police department to be the primary responders to those things. And so the balance of meeting the need of the individual in crisis, while also protecting the society at large, the public who says, I don't want this person that's having a mental health crisis in front of my business or in front of my home. I don't want them near my kid's school. Trying to respond to those needs, at the same time recognizing that most of these folks don't need law enforcement intervention. They need some sort of either medical or social services intervention. But again, those services and those providers are not readily available, but you can always pick up, I don't care where you are in this country, you can always pick up the phone and get a police officer to respond. So that is the question of our time, really, as police professionals and certainly as police leaders, is how do we balance that? How do we prepare a workforce for a job that, yes, did I go to calls involving mentally ill people at the beginning of my career 30 years ago? Of course I did, but they go to far more of them now than I ever had to at the beginning of my career, because again, society has evolved, society has changed, and we have become the primary responders. And so we need to balance those things, and we need to work with the community and with other government and non-government entities to how do those services end up in the hands of those who are better trained and better equipped for some of these problems, and not the primary response entity being law enforcement.
Chief, earlier you had said taking control in the least intrusive manner possible, and somebody asked if that was if that principle is expressed as a matter of policy.
Yes, because it's talked about. It's talked about throughout training. It's talked about in our policies. Now, I'll be very frank about this. Again, not everybody is necessarily good at it, or should I say, not every incident we respond to or that we confront is exactly the same. And so you can have someone who does a great job handling chaos, 8 times out of 10, but 2 times they really struggled with getting control. And that's not always on the police officer. That's sometimes on the person or people that we're dealing with as well. So it's a message that has to be continually sent from my office, from the captains, from the leadership of the police department, reiterated in our training. The benefit of now having body cameras, it gives us an ability to see things that we wouldn't have seen before. And there are times we will watch a video and go, whoa, 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 this worked out, but you can't talk like that. We don't want you talking like that. And I've had instances in my previous departments where I would watch a video and call a person in and say, how do you think that call went? I think it went fine. I didn't have a problem. Well, let me tell you from my perspective, when I watched this and give them a fresh set of eyes and saying, that is not the way we do business. That's not the way I want you doing business. So we have to be in the business of constantly evaluating, reevaluating, and trying to improve our delivery of service and the way we respond to the community.
So somebody had asked, why is it taking so long to get caught up on things like caller bias? These types of calls are not new. I don't know if this is for you, Chief, or Captain Emmett or McMullen.
I think they are relatively new to the consciousness now. To those who believe they've been victimized by it, I hear you, and I'm sorry you feel that way, and I'm sorry that we have dropped the ball as a profession. But I would say, in some respects, the phenomenon is new. Not new that it's happening, new that we recognize it. It's like implicit bias. Research comes out and we start to learn more about it, not just in policing, but in society in general, that we have our biases and they are unconscious to us oftentimes. So as we learn, well, now we have to confront, we have to say, okay, well, how does this apply to me? How does this apply to our police department? And so it may not be new in that it's happened, but I would say it is unfortunately relatively new that it's come to light.
Talking about implicit bias training, somebody asked if the training is reviewable, and then also they asked if it's participatory for community members.
So the training that we initially went through was not offered to people outside of the department. I know that there are some companies out there that offer implicit bias training that also incorporate community members. I believe that was something that the city was looking at in a council report presentation that was given a couple of months ago. I don't think it would be something that the department would be opposed to. And I know that we were looking at some other implicit bias training companies out there working with the Human Resources Department and the City Manager's Office to get that going.
Great. Thank you. Somebody else asked another question about training, and it might have been the same thing. They asked if the stress-related training that you had mentioned earlier was available to the public. I can't remember the stress-related training.
The crisis intervention training?
Oh, probably, yeah.
Is that what it was?
Yeah, I think so.
The one that we attend, or the one that we send our employees through, is for police personnel only. But I'm sure that there are companies out there that offer that type of training outside of law enforcement. I believe I did a Google search not too long ago and got about 60 responses for companies that provide crisis intervention training to private businesses. It's not just a law enforcement training thing anymore.
Yeah, it's become a bit of a cottage industry. I mean, think of workplace violence, school violence, conflict between people. Again, that's in one of those things that is as old as long as there's been two people on the planet. But some of these phenomenon are relatively new. Again, workplace violence being one of them. So I know a number of retired police officers who've gone into the business with psychologists and whatnot to train private business on how to handle, for instance, firing employees and helping people off the property when they're, because of conflict. So yeah, there's a lot of it out there.
Great. Next question, does APD have a use of force continuum?
We do not. We do not have a use of force continuum. We have a use of force policy. And there's an important difference in that. Continuums ceased being in existence early in my career. So in the early 90s, they stopped using a continuum. And the basic difference is that in a continuum, it required a stair-step method of using force. So from our command presence at the bottom of this ladder, if you will, to deadly force being at the top, and then intermediate levels of force in between. And the law did not require that. Case law did not require that. And what we found is that a rigid adherence to this notion of a continuum or stair-step ladder was actually not in the best interest of the public or the police officer. It required a very rigid adherence, and oftentimes we ended up having to use more force as opposed to going back to, and you've heard this term now a lot, reasonable force, and what was reasonable at the time. Now, of course, there is a legal standard for that, and there's plenty of room for discussion there. But to answer the question, the short question with a little bit longer answer is no, we do not use a continuum per se, but we absolutely have a very comprehensive use of force policy. That follows state law, by the way, California, the most recent passage of California law.
Next question. It's pretty long, so I'm just going to read it. What kind of education are APD officers, whether at the academy level or when an employee is hired, provided around three topics? The three topics are: one, the history of policing in America. They ask is there training or curriculum to outline the evolution of policing in America and what their history has been in regards to race and class. Two, critical race theory. And three, trauma-informed care. Because police are the first responders, and in their current responsibilities, they are tasked with community care to some degree. And then they continue to say, if there is currently no training on these topics, what are the plans to develop and deliver such training? And does APD see value in training or education on any of these topics? And I can go back if you'd like.
What was the last one, Sarah?
So it was the history of policing, critical race theory, and trauma-informed care.
So I'll take a little bit of a whack at this. So I mentioned the 31 police academies, right? And they have the umbrella organization of POST who dictates what is required in the training. So some of these things, history of policing, critical race theory, are probably starting to make their way in different ways. Certainly race relations and those things have been a part of the police academy, certainly 30 years ago when I went, and some brief history of policing in America. But I think as society changes, as the expectation of the police change, these topics evolve within the police academy as well. Now, I will say, the bureaucracy of POST, it is very slow to get a lot of things changed. of course, that's unfortunately the nature of a huge state, not the, you know, anyway, huge state, big organization, but these things are starting to happen within police academies and trauma-informed care. I know that those things are starting to happen as well. And then this is some of the, when we talked about the ongoing police training going forward, these are the types of topics, the types of issues that then the police departments themselves start to develop, either develop their own training or look for other opportunities to send their officers as ongoing training moving forward. So I think you'll see these topics in particular, just like community ordered policing, for instance, it is now a much bigger component of the police academy than it was 3 decades ago. So you see this evolution happen as, again, we try to keep up with society. Was there, and then there was another part to that. Did I miss another part to that question?
Sorry, I'm multitasking here. So the history of policing, critical race theory, and the trauma-informed care.
Okay, I think we covered that.
Okay, great. Okay, so the next, and the person who asked that question, if you had a follow-up, just put it in the chat and I can get to that too. Does APD require an immediate or imminent threat for use of force?
Yes.
Okay. And then another use of force question, do all uses of force have to be reported? And then who are they reported to? And then also, are they all reported to the chief?
I'll try to tackle that the best I can. They should be. And we have policies that require it. When use of force is applied in the field, they should notify their supervisor. We require response from the supervisor. We require not only a police report, but then a police review, and it goes through a process, which it is reviewed by our defensive tactics team to ensure that not only was it within policy, but it was within the guidelines of the training that we provide. And then it is routed to another supervisor, typically a lieutenant, who then looks at it, and then they provide their recommendations. And then it comes to me, the Bureau of Operations captain, and then it goes to the chief for final review, and then it is stored into a computer system in which we make sure that is periodically reviewed for any trends or concerns, either by officer or by type of force or use of force that's applied out in the field. So yes, they all should be reported, and it goes through the chain of command.
Great. And then the question before that I asked, does APD require an immediate or imminent threat for use of force? And the answer was yes. It's one of those two. So we just need to get to the bottom of which one. My apologies. So somebody said it's either immediate or imminent. And imminent is a lot broader than immediate.
So Sarah, I'm looking at the overview of AB 392, which required us to accept and adopt a lot of changes to our use of force policy based on the state law changes that happened and that are coming. And one of them is defend against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to another person. And that is straight from the Assembly Bill law.
Okay. Has APD already made the changes required under 392?
Yes, so that was one of the policies that was presented to the city council back on October 20th. And all of the changes to the use of force policy were state law and federal law driven.
Great. Okay. The next question, and this is a lengthy one too, about Lexipol from back in the beginning. How do you respond to critiques of Lexipol that say it makes vague and permissive policies to make it nearly impossible to point to a policy and say that it was violated? Further, Lexipol use of force guidelines lack requirements that have been shown to reduce police violence. For example, Lexipol discourages police departments from requiring police officers to try de-escalation before using force. So
I'm going to tackle that last part. It's it's actually written in our policy that officers will try to de-escalate and use other resources if possible to handle a situation. That is directly from the state law changes. And there is a section in our use of force policy that talks directly to de-escalation.
And if I could just add that it's woefully difficult to try to make policy for every situation that we can possibly encounter. In my 18 years of policing, although categorically some things get classified as particular crime statutes, no two incidents have ever been identical, ever. And so I'm not trying to defend Lexipol, but I will say it is difficult to try to regulate every type of call you could ever go to step by policy.
The next question, in terms of hours spent, how does training on things like CIT compare to training on defensive tactics?
So without jumping ranks or going into Captain Emmett's field, I know that the standard is 4 hours of defensive tactics every 2 years, and Captain Emmett can correct me if I misspeak. And crisis intervention training is a week long. So in comparative models, that's what it would look like.
Yeah, that is the minimum requirement. I will say that APD has been above the minimum requirement ever since I started working here. And no reason not to continue that trend of continuous use of force training, de-escalation training, above and beyond what POST recommends.
And just to clarify, is that a week long every 2 years?
For CIT?
Yeah,
Sorry,
for
Jeff, go ahead.
CIT.
No, CIT is only, it's been a one-time trying to get everybody through. But we will continue that process as soon as we get everyone through the training. I'm sure that we will start it over again to be more continuous. If we're talking about the CP or the continued professional training, the 24 hours every 2 years, we have typically, well, we've done it several different ways, but we try to find a way that there's the least impact to our staffing. This last 24 or this last training that we just completed, it was done in week increments with 16 or so employees going through it each time.
Got it. And then has the department been trained on the legislative changes and the subsequent changes in policy and use of force?
Yes. So part of our recent week-long training was a block on de-escalation and use of force to include the law changes that have happened and that are coming for 2021.
Okay. And so I have just now gotten through the questions that have come in by the chat tool, and now I'm switching over to the questions that we received from the subcommittees. So we are, it's 6:36, so I'm going to do my best to go quick. And if we can get brief but complete answers, that'd be great too. And then if the answer isn't complete enough, if you want to post in the chat that you want more from folks, just do that, and we'll keep following up. The next question is, what kind of ongoing training do APD officers receive? And some of this we have already gotten to, and so if it's already been covered, we can just move on. But this question is there a list of required professional development training officers that training that officers must take?
Yeah, so that would be that those 4 perishable skills. And then I'll just recap the training that was provided this time around, which is fairly similar. Again, maybe the heading might be a little different, but domestic violence, victim assistance, crisis intervention, use of force and de-escalation, and crisis communication.
Okay. And more on training here. Identify all of the training that officers are required to take on the subjects of race, racial profile, bias, or cultural diversity.
Are you, I mean, all of those topics that you just mentioned are training classes going back to when you start the academy.
So I guess just maybe provide a little bit more content, like, so are they complete classes on those subjects, or if we could just get a little bit more information about the training?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have the training outlines in front of me, but depending on the topic, it could range from a 2-hour block that you receive once a year, or it could be a full 8-hour day of training. I'm looking at my training roster here, and back in 2002, I had a 5-hour training block on racial profiling.
Okay.
There was an 8-hour training block on cultural diversity in 2001.
Yeah, that's perfect. And
Okay.
the next question is asking something similar, but about the training for the subject of de-escalation and nonviolence. So I think the hours spent would be great.
So that's one of those topics that is incorporated into, I would say, multiple different training evolutions that they go through. That it's not, and even going back again 20 years when I went through the police academy, it wasn't just a training block in one class. It's taught throughout the entire, from day one, basically, of it, because it's how you talk to people. It's how you're able to gain compliance through using your words. Like the chief talked about, it's kind of like, teaching parenting skills. It's something that is that needs to be taught constantly. And it's more of the repetitive training that we go through. And I don't have a breakdown of the hours, but safe to say in every training block that police officers go through, there is some level of communication and de-escalation training.
And then somebody asked about, we're again on similar subjects, the training that officers are required to take on managing calls for people who are in distress, including mental or emotional distress. And I don't know if you have that in terms of hours.
I don't have the hours in front of me.
And then somebody else said that these questions are really tough, and so we might need to follow up. And is there a manual that is made public, or is that, what additional information, I guess, could we provide folks?
So
go ahead, Matt.
We do have our officer resource manual that's posted. We have our policies that are posted. We've referenced quite often in this discussion. Post does publicize some of the training, and I know that we're focused on the required training, but I feel it's important to at least spotlight that some of our officers go well beyond the requirements, whether it be their personal endeavors through higher education in college, through criminal justice management, through those types of endeavors often include the topics that we're discussing today at length, either by semester or quarter classes that they're required to take.
Great. And actually, steering committee member Al Mance just sent me a link to post.ca.gov with some of the de-escalation training. So I'm going to go ahead and post that into the chat so everybody has that available. And continuing to follow up on that, who is leading the training, and is there a set of goals or KPIs that they're expected to achieve?
So the training is set through post. If we're going to talk specifically about use of force and de-escalation, I'll say the training minimums are set through post. If we at APD want to incorporate more training, we are always able to do that. We just can't drop below the level that has been established through post. All of the post training outlines that are taught, whether they're internal or external, are reviewed. Especially our internal training that we provide is reviewed prior to the training going out to the rest of the department, so that the command staff can offer recommendations and changes if needed prior to the rest of the department receiving the training.
And frequently, an instructor has gone to an instructor school that is also governed by post, that teaches them not only the skills of whatever it is they're going to teach, but adult learning concepts and those kinds of things. So they certify the instructor. Oftentimes it's our person inside the police department. We sent them to the instructor course, and then they come back and they teach posts guidelines to our officers.
I believe, like for use of force instructors, it's a minimum of 120 hours of schooling that they have to go through prior to being use of force instructors. So they're getting 120 hours of instruction to then turn around and to be able to teach that instruction.
A follow-up to that question is asking if the instructors are white.
Some of them.
Okay. Okay, I'll just keep going. What training at the academy and you talked about the 24 hours and the every 2 years, what training at the academy and the 24 hours every 2 years involve working with people with disabilities and neurodivergent folks? For example, we talked a lot about training and get responses, but do all officers get trained on working with people who have hearing impairments or nonverbal people?
So I believe one of the learning domains that's taught in the academy is specifically to what you're talking about there, Sarah. I don't know the number of hours off the top of my head that that learning domain will cover. But every police officer that we have has gone through that training.
Yeah, and it's evolved like everything else. I keep going back to the evolution. I remember 30 years ago, training in the academy about people with hearing disabilities and those kinds of things and how to communicate. But I can virtually guarantee you no one used the word autism in the police academy 30 years ago. And there's not a police academy in the state that's not going to talk about autism now because it's such a prevalent issue within our society.
So just to follow up, at the academy, Chief, are things like autism covered and the like?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
great.
dealing with folks with disabilities, and again now autism is one that is talked about.
Okay. So just to, there's a lot more questions, but somebody just wanted to extend their thanks to all of the speakers and their appreciation for your time and attention to detail to help improve the lives of Alamedans and those who spend time here. So a shout out. And then the next one is, what changes has the department made to its use of force policy in the last year?
And so can I just jump in there and again to Chief Ben's remarks without repeating it over and over. We never step into the flowing river, the same river twice, I think is how the saying goes. They're constantly being revised, looked at, and adjusted accordingly. When I started, we didn't use computers, we hand wrote reports. And so those manuals were printed, and those didn't get updated nearly as much as they are now with the evolution of technology and everything. As we have progressed as society and as an organization, those things are frequently reviewed, and updates are appropriately pushed out to our personnel. And then we have a tracking mechanism to make sure that they have read and understood each of the policies that we have issued.
All right, next question. Various advocacy organizations have recommended 8 policy changes, including banning chokeholds and strangleholds, requiring de-escalation, requiring warning before shooting, requiring officers to exhaust all alternatives before shooting, duty to intervene, banning shooting at moving vehicles, and requiring a use of force continuum, and requiring comprehensive reporting. Which of these have the Alameda Police Department enacted, and why or not? Why or why not?
So this is, I think, referring to like the 8 can't wait. Sounds.
I think so.
I think it's open to interpretation a little bit. When I look at those, I think we're pretty darn close to being in alignment with all of those. You know, shooting at vehicles, I know that that's been one that's come up quite a bit, and that is it is not a technique that we want our employees to use. But again, I would hate for one of our employees to not be able to take that action when it could potentially keep others safe because our policy says you shall not. And I think to what Chief Fenn and Captain McMullen have talked about earlier tonight is no situation is the same. You will never come across the same situation twice. And I think when you start talking about you know, shooting at vehicles specifically, if God forbid we would ever have to use that tactic to keep others safe, I would hope that our community members would want our officers to take whatever action necessary to keep them and their loved ones safe. Again, I think the 8 can't wait recommendations, I think a lot of them are open to interpretation depending on how you look at and read our policy.
But several of them are already absolutely implemented, such as chokeholds, because they've been banned by state law, so they are not authorized within our policy. We've talked about the continuum of force, and I think that has an application in some places throughout the country where I find it hard to believe, but there are places in the country where there's no use of force policy at all in a police department. I can't imagine that. Fortunately, that's not the case here. And then other elements of the 8 can't wait have been enacted by AB 392, Senate Bill 230. So as best we can, we're very, very close to complying or having those elements as part of our use of force policy and as part of the police department.
Chief, following up on that, somebody wrote, Governor Newsom and others across California have called for the ban of carotid holds. What possible legitimate police reason does Alameda have to still allow them? That sounds like we don't.
No,
We don't.
Okay. And then the next question is, how are city-sponsored continuing education / training scheduled? Is there a regular schedule for ongoing training, and who makes the decision about what training subjects are covered?
So there is that ongoing training that has to be completed every 24 months. And then again, it just really depends on what ancillary duties the officers may have. There's mandatory training if you are a Marine Patrol officer. You have to go to an 80-hour course on maritime operations. If you're a defensive tactics instructor, there's 120 hours of recommended training that you have to go to prior to being an instructor. If you're a firearms instructor, there's an 80-hour course that you have to go to prior to being an instructor. So there is other mandatory training depending on what responsibilities the officers have. And again, most of those are regulated through post. And some of the other training is based on current assignments. If you're an investigator, there might be an interview and interrogation course that would be beneficial to the person in their assignment, or there may be a sexual assault investigation course that would be beneficial, but not necessarily recommended. So it just depends on the positions that the officers are in.
Sarah, can I make a quick comment
please.
here? I put on my administrator hat, the guy who's responsible for the budget. Training police officers is exceptionally expensive. It is, it is an expensive endeavor, and that's critically important. I think we've proven that here, but we have to understand every time, it's like the police academy, and this is the problem that Post has continually. They're trying to govern police departments from Los Angeles to Modoc County and everywhere in between. And so every time the legislature says, we now want you to train 4 hours or 8 hours on, you pick the topic, when they extrapolate how expensive that is and how it extends the police academy, that is partly why we don't see training change very quickly, or why it's very slow to do so, because it is so terribly expensive. Every time we lose a police officer to training, well, not every time, we try desperately to do it so that it doesn't cost us overtime, but frequently it costs us a lot of overtime. So I just have to throw that out. I would be remiss if I did not throw out the budget realities of training police officers. And I think it's just important for everybody to understand. I would love nothing more than for a police officer every week to have one day of just training, because there are so many topics that we could train them on. It's just not feasible. So as we, again, try to evolve, try to better ourselves as an organization, we are constantly having to make decisions as to where do we invest our training dollar. What are the most important topics? And here's the hard part. There hasn't been a topic brought up tonight that in my mind isn't terribly important. So you can see the dilemma that we're constantly in and trying to train and better our police department.
Back to Lexipol. Somebody asked, why does the department base its policies on Lexipol?
Well, because it's a good service, and I get the criticism, and I'm not going to sit here and defend any private company. They can do that themselves. I know from having policies written at the beginning of my career by one particular police department that we would go years sometimes without any review of policy or about them being rewritten, or someone would be given the project of, here, update the policy manual. And fortunately, and where I was for most of my career, we had several attorneys, or several police officers happened to be attorneys, so they were good at researching case law. But if you didn't have that, this is how we ended up in some of these problems throughout the state and throughout the country of old antiquated policies, because it was beyond their ability of the police department to keep them up to date. And at least with Lexipol, we have a full staff that does that. So every time there's a change in the law, every time there's a change in case law, we get immediate response from them. We are able to change our policy on a dime if need be to make sure that it's the most current best practice and it's compliant with law. So again, you can argue the merits of private companies and all that, and I don't have a problem with that, but you have to know that we are much more responsive and have much more timely and updated policies thanks to having a service that does it for us. Now, the onus is still on us every time they give us an update for us to review it and make sure it applies to what we do, that it conforms to our expectations, and then we have to get it out and train our folks in it and make sure that they're compliant with it. So this is not a passive thing just because we have a service.
Somebody asked a follow-up to that, Chief, and they asked, can't the city attorney be tasked with keeping the APD in compliance with state law?
Yes, but it would eat up a position. I mean, again, I would need somebody, frankly, I'd probably have to have somebody trained in or assigned in the city attorney's office to do that, and it'd be almost a full-time job for them. And again, that's expensive. And they're able to, go ahead.
I can just interject here, because my career's probably about as many decades as Randy's, as the chief. And I can tell you, having represented police departments for close to 30 years, that it was a lot more difficult back before Lexipol to try and incorporate some of these policy changes. And the fact that now that you've got this fairly large organization that is keeping up every day with sort of the developments in the law, it does sort of help come up with sort of best practices and sort of the quote unquote breaking news in terms of like what the new case law developments. But the city attorney's office also it regularly monitors significant updates in the law with regard to how policies and procedures, and we have a very close relationship with the department and assist them in developing these policies regularly.
Yeah, we send our Lexipol updates frequently to the city attorney's office to make sure that it complies with what we're trying to do locally.
Somebody asked, how much does Lexipol cost? I don't know if you have that.
Does anybody know off the?
No,
We can get you that.
no. Yeah.
Okay, So somebody said, it occurs to me that increasing diversity within APD might be a positive step toward making policing in our community safer all around. What is APD and our city council doing to increase diversity?
I will make a broad statement first, because I've only been here a very short time, as we established, that every police department in America is trying to diversify. Every school district in America is trying to diversify. Industry after industry after industry are trying to diversify and be more reflective of the communities that they serve, or the communities wherein they're located. So this was a struggle for me as a police chief. This was a struggle for me as a recruiting officer many years ago. I just want you to know that, and I'll let the captains here speak more specifically locally. I just want you to know we are all fighting for the same. And I used to have these, in Fairfield, we actually teamed with the school district. We'd go and recruit together. We actually would go to historic Black colleges and try to recruit together, recruit teachers and police officers to come to Fairfield. It was difficult because they were looking for the same thing as well, to try to diversify. So please understand, we understand the community's desire for that. You have to understand our desire for it as well.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, when we advertise and go out and are recruiting to bring people into APD, one of the things that we constantly talk about is, are these folks from Alameda? Because those are the folks that we want, the folks that live in town, the folks that are invested in what Alameda is going to look like in 15, 20, 25 years from now. And then on top of that, it's making sure that they meet the standard of what the community expects. And unfortunately, everyone is looking for that same candidate, not just the city of Alameda, but every law enforcement agency. And to be honest, it's not a popular profession to get into right now. And that pool of candidates has really shrunk over the years. 20 years ago, when I got hired, there was 600 people that put in for 3 positions. Well, we have more than 3 positions now, and we're lucky if we get about 25 to 50 people who apply for those positions. And they're applying to all of these other agencies as well. But to the chief's point, we are always looking to have our workforce be a reflection of our community. And that is always a topic of conversation internally and with the human resources department.
I was muted. It's 7 o'clock, and that was the time that we had booked, but we have still 23 more questions. So I was going to ask if we could maybe continue for another half hour, and then the questions that are still left at the end, maybe we can either type them up or we could have those at the beginning of the next session. How is everybody doing? Chief Fenn, you want to?
Go ahead.
Okay.
That's all.
All right, we're going to go to 7:30, and then we'll have a hard stop, and then we'll figure out what's left. I'm going to ask 2 questions at once, just to knock some out. How does Alameda Police explain that 62% of juvenile arrests in Alameda are Black? What is Alameda Police Department doing to disrupt the school to prison pipeline? And then related, what specialized training does Alameda Police Department have for dealing with minors? Maybe those are 2 totally separate questions.
Yeah, can you go one more time and I'll
I'm going to ask them separately too. Okay, the first one. How does Alameda Police explain that 62% of juvenile arrests in Alameda are Black? What is Alameda Police Department doing to disrupt the school to prison pipeline?
So I don't know if I have the right answer for this, but I will say that we take every call individually, that we assess the crime that was reported to us, and that we try to do our very best to take the appropriate action. I would have to, I think, get some empirical data on all of those 62 arrests but I can say that we take measures to release all juvenile arrests back to their parents in most circumstances. Barring extreme violence, that is typically what occurs. We either give the juveniles a notice to appear and release them directly back to their parents, or we bring them to the police department where we do a brief booking process and then we release them back to their parents. Our goal is rehabilitation, not a pipeline to prison. That is not a functionality of the police department. Our function is to investigate those crimes when they are reported to us, and then do what we do and take appropriate action in response to those events that we are called to.
And then the other question that was unrelated was, what specialized training does APD have for dealing with minors?
So I do know that in the academy there was when I went, there was an entire section on juvenile detentions, and 602 and 601 of the Welfare and Institution Codes that is specific to minors as it relates to criminality and crime statutes. And so there's some specific training in which police officers go through. We had at one time a school resource officer program where those officers also went to a 2-week school in regards to how to appropriately police school-age children.
And then on top of that, years ago, when our staffing was a little different, we actually had a youth services unit within our investigations division. It was a supervisor and 2 detectives that were assigned along with a number of school resource officers at the time. And so we used to have an entire unit that was dedicated to dealing with youth, and just unfortunately, as the years have kind of dictated how we have to deploy our resources, that unit's no longer around.
Captain, I'm going to follow-up question for you from before. What 3 positions are you hiring for, and didn't the council vote to impose a hiring freeze?
Well, I was referencing 20 years ago when I got hired, there was
Okay.
3 open positions. Hiring freeze, hiring cap. I'm not sure what lingos was used. But we have been working closely with the city manager's office to stay within that number that was directed from council. Since that meeting back in June, we've had several employees retire. And so the hires that we have made are still staying within that number that was directed from council.
Okay. What is the process by which APD policies are reviewed or revised? I think we talked about this with Lexipol, but how often does this happen? What review or oversight is required? And who is tasked with the job of maintaining the policy and procedures documents?
So I'll start, and then if Captain McMullen or Chief Fenn want to jump in. But so as the services captain, the Lexipol policy manual falls under my bureau. Lexipol sends out updates constantly. On October 20th, we asked City Council to approve 15 policies. 2 days later, there were 3 more policies that Lexipol had pushed out to us for review that are still waiting to be looked at. But it is I don't want to say a daily occurrence, but almost a weekly basis, they are sending out information for us to review. That initial review starts with me. If it is something that is state or federal law, it's pretty much a no-brainer that we're going to have to accept that change. And then depending on the policy, it could be a uniform policy. It could be a property and evidence policy, depending on how it impacts us specifically in Alameda. that policy could be pushed out to the unit that is, say it's the property and evidence policy, that policy could be pushed out for review to our property and evidence clerk to make sure that the policy language change jives with everything that they do on a daily basis prior to that policy being implemented through the department. But because Lexipol has, I think, 47 attorneys on staff that are reviewing case law and policy or law change almost, it seems daily, those reviews are pretty regular.
Great. Another question for you, Captain Emmett. What training does the APD offer that is specific to Alameda and the Alameda department?
So that training is going to happen in the field training program. All of the training that our officers receive prior to coming to us is going to be what the state mandates. And then once they get to us, they're going to learn how we do it in Alameda. A lot of that is procedural. It's not so much policy driven. When they're in the FTO program, I mean, obviously we're teaching them the policies so that they understand what they are, but how to do the day-to-day job is more procedural information that is being taught to them in the 19 weeks. And then any training, internal training class that we would have, whether it's defensive tactics, firearms, tactical communications, all of those training outlines that are completed are going to be geared towards our policies and procedures to ensure that our officers are doing the things that we need them to do on a daily basis.
And next question, does the APD collect data on how often it makes stops, either pedestrian or traffic stops?
All officer activity that's initiated or recorded through our computer-aided dispatch is logged somehow. But it's difficult in regards to that data because of the variety and the lack of uniformity in every situation that arises. I'll give you a perfect example. You're on a car stop and someone comes up to you and wants to report a separate crime, but there's no call for service. There's no one called to report a crime, but someone's reporting it to you in person while you're conducting another stop or enforcement action. And so the avenues in which they get reported are diverse in their very nature, but we do keep logs of crimes, traffic stops, citations, warnings. Those things do get recorded.
Great. Next question. What is the APD policy on making an arrest based on resisting arrest?
I don't know if I understand the question, so I'm going to pass it to my colleagues.
I'll repeat it. So the question is, what is the policy on making an arrest based on somebody resisting arrest?
So resisting arrest is a penal code that if it's violated, it would be a crime. It would be 148A1 of the penal code. That's resisting or delaying or obstructing a police officer during their official duties. That in and of itself is a crime. So I'm not quite sure. I mean, there wouldn't be a policy that's driven on somebody making an arrest for a crime that's been committed. Okay. Or a penal code that's been violated.
That makes sense. The next question is, how many hours of continuing education are officers expected to take every year? And are those hours mandated in any subject area?
I think we've kind of covered that.
Yeah,
I think we've covered it, extensively.
And the mandate, they are mandated as the specific training. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great. Easy answer. All right, this is a long one, so I'm just going to repeat it and then I can repeat it again if you'd like. How does APD monitor officer activity? Are officers required to fill out activity reports or other types of documentation of how they spend their days? And are these documents reviewed by sergeants or others in the chain of command? And then how does the APD monitor officers for inactivity? Are there penalties or consequences associated with failing to make certain numbers of stops, arrests, or issue a certain number of citations?
So we have it at times in the history of my tenure here had officer activity logs where we have logged our actions in 15-minute increments. We don't have quotas. And again, I hate to keep saying this, but it's so difficult sometimes to capture that. Again, using just a quick story. If you're sent to a call for service and it's a simple theft or a petty theft, and you're writing that police report, that's not doing nothing, but you're not doing something else during that time. Either you're writing a police report or you're doing a follow-up investigation. A lot of that data is captured. We expect our patrol supervisors to be monitoring what people are doing. A lot of that monitoring happens over the police radio, but there's other functions in being able to do that. And we expect our officers to be diligent in their duties, getting out of their patrol cars, meeting with members of the public, meeting with business owners, and so on and so forth. And so we do at least pay attention to that, but there are no quotas, and some of that is extraordinarily difficult to capture unless we're doing daily activity logs. But that in and of itself is somewhat time consuming.
Going back to the question before regarding making an arrest for resisting arrest, somebody commented that to many people, when they see an arrest for resisting arrest and nothing else, it raises a red flag. And it means that the person wasn't committing the crime that the police first approached them for. And so they said that it's often seen as an indication that the person was being arrested for having a bad attitude. Just a clarifying comment there. And then another question, what about training? This is kind of going back to the training question, Chief, that we've addressed, but what about training for call operators, emergency and non-emergency?
Oh, can you speak to that, Captain Emmett?
Yeah, so they also go through a 6.5 month long internal training program that we have at APD. They also have, I want to say it's a 4-week almost academy-like that they will go through. It's a little different than the police officers. They don't have to go through the academy prior to start working inside of our communication center, but at some point in time, they do have to go to a training academy. And again, the training internally is about 6 months long, maybe a little longer than that. And they are also managed under post. Dispatchers are one of the few professional staff or non-sworn staff that have post requirements. I don't know all of the ins and outs of their mandatory training like I do with the sworn personnel, but they are managed through post.
Next question also about training. Is training reactive or proactive, and what triggers reactive training?
So I would say go. Sorry, Chief.
I think we're both going to say both. Go ahead.
No, I think it is. I think it truly is both. There are some that is like we're talking extensively on the call that is mandated, that is done preactively and proactively. And then there are some, as Chief Fenn described, we wear body-worn cameras. We expect our managers and our sergeants to review those periodically and at random at times to make sure that we're providing the level of service that we expect from our police officers. And in that aspect, I would say that it is reactive. When we find that someone wasn't doing what they should have been doing, we try to at least diagnose the problem. Is it a lack of training or something else? And when we do identify that it potentially is a lack of training or not necessarily a lack of training sometimes, but a lack of understanding by the employee of the training they received, we will either try to provide it in a different mechanism or manner to ensure that we correct anything that's not up to our standards. And so that is a form of reactive training that does occur quite regularly and is documented as well.
The next question, this also might be something, Chief, that we've already gotten through with Lexipol, but how are updates made to departmental policies? What level of research is required to justify or trigger a change in policy? Are there preferred research organizations whose research is used to set policy? Does the department seek out this research proactively or only in response to an incident?
Yeah, I think we've covered all that.
Okay, great. Over the time period from 2018 to present, there have been 178 resisting arrest charges. How can we trace this to the original reported crime, and how many of the cases were subsequently dropped?
I don't have
Oh.
that data in front of me. It's something that we could look into. And I think it had several categories, but the last were just resonating with how many were dropped and other criminality involved in the calls. But I don't have the data in front of me.
Okay. What is the
Can-
policy? Oh, sorry,
I'm
go ahead. Sorry.
I'll just make a statement as a longtime police officer and as a police chief, because I think people hear this in the community, especially if they know police officers. We don't like arrests for only resisting arrest. We don't like that. We get trained very early on. Look, nobody likes an arrest just for resisting arrest. Part of it is we're hoping to never get in that position, that somehow we're able to get through whatever it is that we have to get through. That, again, going back to taking control of the situation or getting through a ticket or getting through a call without it devolving to the level of having to make an arrest for delaying and obstructing a police officer. I'm telling you, we try to avoid that. But there are times where people do not cooperate. And if they would just cooperate, if they would just help us get through what it is that we're trying to get through, whether it be, again, identify someone, write a ticket, ensure the welfare, whatever the case may be, we'll walk away. We won't make that arrest. And then there are times that I watch police officers lose their patience and they make an arrest too fast for resisting arrest or delaying a police officer. So I'm not blaming only one side of the equation. I know that there's another side of the equation. So when we look at those things, when they come across, the expectation of the sergeant reviewing the report, those of the chain of command, is that when you get those cases, you got to take a look at them. And there are times that they're going to happen, review the body, the camera, and there are going to be times, look, if this person would have just complied with the lawful orders of a police officer, this would have never happened. And there are times where we'll look and say, hey, you need to be more patient, officer. You rushed this, you created this urgency, and then we have to take appropriate action of either training, retraining, discipline, whatever might be appropriate.
Great. What is the policy regarding termination of officers during their probationary period?
I wouldn't say that there's a policy, but we try to look at each termination. Oh, sorry, Chief, go ahead.
Well, maybe I can just, Alan, do you want to talk about how
Yeah.
probation is part of the testing process?
Yeah, basically, the department doesn't have a specific policy with regard to a probationary officer. Probation is the time for evaluating whether or not an officer fits within the culture and the philosophy of the department. And so it's just a difference in probation is just a difference in status between being, having a civil service right to certain proceedings, POBAR rights. POBAR is a peace officer bill of rights, certain labor rights, versus allowing the department to sort of make decisions within that probationary period about whether or not you're going to allow the officer to continue. So I would say the department when evaluates each probationary officer, sort of on an individualized basis to see if they meet the needs and fit in with the goals of the organization.
Okay. Next question is, resisting arrest charges have increased 52% from 18 to 19 and are on trend to go even higher in 2020, which we heard before. But this question is, what is Alameda Police doing to de-escalate conflict situations? Are you looking at potential patterns of certain officers, types of calls, or races of arrestees that disproportionately appear within a resisting arrest statistics?
Yeah, I think as we mentioned, it's an ongoing review, and I'll let the captains, if they want to add anything more specific to what we've already covered.
The only thing I would add is take use of force, for example. The programs that we use to track and monitor uses of force have warning systems built into them where they will keep track of a couple of different data points, but they will also alert us to officers that may be involved in more vehicle pursuits than others, or they may be involved in use of force incidents than other police officers, and it'll require us to take a second look at the incidents they were involved in to do more to do a secondary review to make sure we didn't miss anything the first time.
Got it. And I'm going to go ahead and ask one last question, and then I'll turn it over to Jolene, who'll close the meeting. And know that we didn't answer all the questions. We got through a bunch of them, but we didn't answer them all. And so we'll figure out a way to follow up on all of the remaining questions, which there's about a dozen or so. But this last question is that Black Alamedans have repeatedly testified to being pulled over for traffic violations at higher frequencies than their white counterparts. Comparing APD provided data with population data, Black people appear to be more than 6 times as likely to be pulled over. What does APD believe might factor into this pattern, and what steps has Alameda Police taken to address the racial disparity in its traffic stops?
Well, I'll be honest, it's the first time I'm hearing that data. For one, I don't know what review, if there's been any review of that kind of data before. I have to defer to the captains to tell me that.
I don't recall any specific review of traffic stop data. I too have not heard that statistic before, but it gives rise an alarm, and it's something that I think that we will be taking a look at in the future for sure.
Yeah, I think that's part of this whole process, right? Is to look at those things and dig deeper, dig behind the numbers,
and then
see what's going on.
It was clarified that the data comes from the posted reports. And then just to make a quick comment about this, from one of the steering committee members, just saying anecdotally, Alameda has a reputation among Black folks for not being a friendly community. They have friends that won't come and visit them here. So with that, Jolene, I believe you should be able to unmute yourself and
Can you hear me?
close us out. Yes, we can hear you.
All right, guys, we made it, night one. I just want to say thank you to everyone for joining, both here and on YouTube. Thank you, Chief Fenn, Captain Emmett, Captain Mullen, all of our subcommittee members, Al, Christine. Just thank you all for being here. Sarah, thank you for moderating. We appreciate you taking the time with all those questions. Reminders, again, this is part 1 of a 3-part series. The next one will be Thursday, November 12th from 6:30 to 8:30 p.m. I believe, Sarah, you posted that on city's Facebook page?
Facebook, it's also on the city's website under events.
I also want to shout out just everyone, Veterans Day tomorrow. Take the time, say thanks to those who've served, to all our educators and parents. Enjoy the day. And we'll see you all on Thursday.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.